So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue, The Statesman. We are in part 14, which means by the end of this we will be at 28 hours, a little over that, probably close to 30 hours into this series. So I'd like to begin by rereading some of the material that we read last time, just for context. So the visitor says, "So which of these incorrect constitutions is least difficult to live with, given that they are all difficult? And which the heaviest to bear? Should we take a brief look at this, although a discussion of it will be a side issue in relation to the subject now set before us? And yet, at any rate, in general, perhaps everything that all of us do is for the sake of this sort of thing." Young Socrates responds, "We should certainly look at it." Well then, what you should say is that if there are three sorts of constitutions, the same one is at the same time exceptionally difficult and easiest. What are you saying? Just this. Monarchy, I'm saying, rule by a few, and rule by many. There were these three sorts of constitution we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, with which we have currently now been deluged. Yes, there were. Well then, let's divide these, each single one into two, and make 6, separating off the correct one from these on its own as a 7th. How so? Out of monarchy, let's make kingly and tyrannical rule. Out of the sort that doesn't involve many, we said there was the auspiciously named aristocracy and oligarchy, while out of the sort that does involve many, there was democracy, which we then called single and put it down as such. But now in turn we must put this 2 down as double. How then, and dividing by what criterion? By the one that is no different from the other cases. Even its name, democracy, is now double. Even if its name, democracy, is now double. But certainly, ruling according to laws and contrary to laws belongs both to this and to the others. Yes, it does. Well, at the time when we were looking for the correct constitution, this cut was not useful, as we demonstrated in what we said before. But since we have now set that correct constitution to one side, and have put down the rest as necessary, in the case of these, certainly, the criterion of contrary to and abiding by laws cuts each of them in 2. It seems so, given what has now been said. Well then, when monarchy is yoked in good written rules, which we call laws, it is the best of all 6. But if it is without laws, it is difficult and heaviest to live with. Possibly, says young Socrates. And as for the rule of those who are not many, just as few is in the middle between one and a large number, let's suppose it to be middling in both ways, while that of the mass, in its turn, we may suppose to be weak in all respects, and capable of nothing of any importance, either for good or for bad as judged in relation to the others, because under it offices are distributed in small portions among many people. For this reason, if all the types of constitution are law-abiding, it turns out to be the worst of them. But if all are contrary to law, the best. And if all are uncontrolled, living in a democracy takes the prize. But if they are ordered, life in it is least livable. And in first place, and best by far, will be life in the first, except for the 7th. For of all of them, that one we must separate out from the other constitutions, like a god from men. And so this is where I'd like to pause and do some reflecting. So at this point, we've been making our way through these different constitutions. We have the visitor mentions a few, one being monarchy. We have oligarchy, aristocracy, democracy. But he keeps rule by the few into one. So we have the rule by one, which would be our monarch. We have the rule by few, which includes the oligarchy and monarchy, and then we have the rule by many, which is our democracy. And so he's on this path now of splitting everything into two. And so of the monarchy, we can have this potential for a just monarch or a tyranny. Now of the latter two, that of rule by many and rule by few, what we are given to play with is the criterion of contrary to and abiding by laws. And it's no secret where Plato falls on his preference, his political preference. But it's not enough, I think, for us to consider or just suggest that Plato's favorite form of government is a monarchy. But we have to dive deeper into this. It's necessary in order to get to this formal domain in which we are describing the statesman and this perfect constitution. He says, when monarchy is yoked in good written rules, which we call laws, it is the best of all six. But if it is without laws, it is difficult and heaviest to live with. So here, I want to reflect on this a little bit. For in order to understand this, we have to think about the nature of laws. We have to think about what their purpose is. And up until this point, we've been discussing laws as this, what I've been calling a step-down function. And what makes them a step down is that they are not a living form of reason, but rather a memory, and often a distorted memory. Often the law is a structure that is resistant to change. A law is something that is fixed, immovable. It's not as though law is permanently fixed, but there's a general underlying quality of permanence in it. And this is not without good reason. Laws are written, in many cases, by precedent. It is by some former experience that we have learned from, that we now enact into law such that some adverse thing or undesired behavior does not happen again. And we can also say that some laws have been written with nothing but ill purposes in mind. We may think of the tyrant, and these laws are inherently counterproductive to the establishment of a secure society. That outside from being just rigid and immovable, laws that are yoked in wickedness are those that close off the soul of man to the divine. They disrupt relation for the sake of disruption, or for control, or for power, whatever it might be. And what results is an inherent disharmony and discord, not only among individuals, but also among institutions. And I think it boils down to the very way in which people make sense of things, how they reason through problems. The laws can cut quite deep, in other words. I think there's more to be said there, because I think there are different types of laws, but we'll leave that thought as it is for now. So we come to the monarch. We come to a civil institution that is ruled by one. Of course, underneath the one, there is an apparatus. There's a bureaucracy. Perhaps, like in England's case, there is a parliament. In different ages, the parliament had different powers, different responsibilities. Also similar responsibilities throughout the ages. But the point being that the king, if he is to say something to his society, it doesn't just automatically happen. There's a process by which his voice and the meaning that is encoded in all of it is put to practical use. Again, whether good or for bad. Another thing that we cannot fail to mention is the significance of the position of the monarch. We often refer to the monarch as the sovereign, the chief nobility. Within certain periods, there has been a close relationship between the class of the priests and that of the monarch. And there is this suggestion that the office has a divine quality to it. And again, in different eras, in different forms, this relationship between the divinity and the civil institution has varied. There has been some antagonism in certain ages. There has been a tacit agreement in others. There has been a union in yet others. But in many cases, there is a thread through which the monarch is identified as being someone that has some divine quality to him. Or at the very least, the office of the monarch is appointed by the divinity. There's a divine right of kingship. Now, however I may feel, or however we may feel in the milieu that we are brought up in, we have to put that aside because it's not important here. What is important is, again, understanding the office, understanding how value is transmitted through these offices, and I would say also how the mind is affected, perhaps on the individual level. Now, if we start with a term that is closely associated with the monarch, that being sovereign, the etymological roots point towards that which is highest, supreme, chief, over, beyond, supreme, surface, above, over. And this is something that has been encountered many times on this podcast, in the Proverbs especially. I'm never satisfied in my understanding of exploring this. Not because I haven't come to conclusions that are reasonable. Of course, there have been many of those. But this is such a tricky subject, one that is difficult to understand at first glance. Once the mind seemingly gets warmed up into the sphere, it's easier to grasp. But such a powerful institution is difficult to see. Certainly, it is difficult to see exactly how it filters down into the lower orders of society. But let's start with this idea of above. So if we think about something that is above, we have that which is below relative to it. And of course, above the monarch, there is something that is above. We move into more divine territory at that point, but nonetheless, what we have here is a vertical. And the first question that I have is, what is this vertical? What is this aboveness and belowness? What makes the monarch, the sovereign, above what is perceived to be the lower orders of society? Now, I think the answer lies within a word that has just been mentioned, that of order. Instinctively, when I spoke of that which was below, I spoke of a lower order. This would seem to imply that what I believe is that what is above is also an order. It is a higher order. So, on an even deeper layer, it would seem that although the sovereign is this individual or conception of an office which an individual would occupy, that has a particular ordering function to it. And perhaps, maybe I would keep it there. Because I was going to say perhaps order itself in that category or in that office. But it is by the nature of the king to express that order, perhaps to receive it from God, to facilitate. And this is no simple matter, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I want to stay on what this order is. So, there are plenty of things, plenty of material objects that are set out in front of me. I can take the microphone, I can take the computer. There's a bunch of knickknacks on my counter. There's some chess pieces that I've been using as symbolic entities that I can preserve memories in and all this sort of thing for the podcast. And there's this television that I use as a monitor that I never use anymore that just sort of sits there with this sort of standby red light on all of the time. There's a couple of images that are on my wall. One of the muscular system, sort of an anatomical chart, and one of Salvador Dali's painting that I don't understand. It's some surrealist art that probably doesn't have any meaning to it. But there are some forms that are recognizable, like the shape of a woman and what seems like a Greek face that is coming out of this disjointed architecture. Again, it doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, all of these things, I think I can say, possess order. Now, all of these things are not the same, so it doesn't mean that order makes things the same. But I think it is a prerequisite for thingness in general. So I'll take a step back for a moment. I'll grab one of these chess pieces off of the shelf. Now this happens to be a pawn. Now this pawn is of a particular type of chess set. It is it was bought in Turkey. It is it is the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And it's plated in this sort of gold-like material. It's quite heavy. It's metal. And there are many characteristics to this thing, from the dress to the figure, again to the other characteristics that I've mentioned, its hardness, its weight, all that sort of thing. The felt that's underneath the base of the piece. There's a certain order here that at first instance it seems to be difficult to describe exactly what this order is. But if order is to be something that is responsible for or prerequisite to thingness or being, that'll be another word to use, then there is a unique order that brings together the material elements in such a way that expresses what I can perceive from this thing. And of course, the mechanism of my perception is another type of order. But sticking with the pawn piece, I'm amazed just to reflect and to consider on the level of complexity that is involved in the expression of this piece, of this thing. So what do we have? With regard to this word order, again, as we've identified, this is something fundamental and preceding that of the term sovereignty, which we've said is something that is above, or that which is highest in terms of order. So we have to discuss this order, and we've discussed that this order is common among all things. It is a prerequisite for being. It is something that does not make being the same. It is something that causes the expression of uniqueness, I think, to a degree. But it is not uniqueness for the sake of uniqueness. Order describes a series of relations. These series of relations, at least from a subjective standpoint, are perceived and understood as various qualities to the best that I can perceive something. So in the case of this chess piece, it's gold, it's heavy, it looks like a man with ancient dress on. It is the piece of a pawn. And of this unique expression, I can identify materially, but also more of in a spiritual sense or in a conceptual frame, that this piece is expressed because it has some purpose, not just because it is designed by man, but because there's a particular way in which things are related. And that particular order, it may not be particularly high, especially in the case of a rock, for example, but nonetheless it has some uniqueness and purposeful direction to it. And in the material sense, it has some ordering of molecules and of atoms such that this thing can exist and present itself. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with the idea that order is the fitting together of things. Now, I think there's an important part about this ordering. It has to do with the mind. It has to do with the subjective experience and perception. Our minds, I believe, are a microcosm of the broader cosmic order. That if the order is to have this intelligible, reasonable expression to it, then it is something that can be attended to. It is something that can be observed, recreated, or participated in. And while when we speak of order, I think there are plenty of possibilities. Reality affords all of them, such that things may come together that ought not be together, and yet, if they come together against the ought, they are held there by some force or some coercion. I think this is approaching something like a tyranny, but I bring this up because when we think about a situation in which things are brought together, as we've described, something that is order, and imagine all of the different scenarios in which order can happen, the antagonism is a particularly interesting relationship, or at least the perceived antagonism. Like the strong nuclear force, for example. Normally, we have things of a like charge, particles of a like charge that repel each other. But in the case of the strong nuclear force, we have a very strong, consolidated center that holds a lot of energy. And while particles on the outside of this relationship adhere to this these rules and laws that say that they cannot be brought together very closely, because it would take maybe a lot of energy to do so. The point that I find interesting about this is that this relationship exists at all. You would think that all forms of antagonism, in order to produce harmony, would reduce. And yet, there are all of these intricate ways in which something can be, in one instance, under a certain set of conditions, and yet, in many others, be not allowed to be together, to participate together. And by the king's expression, there are many ways in which the king can bring individuals, can collaborate the collection of souls. And from all of this we say that some of it is good and some of it is bad. This goodness and badness we come to understand by observation, by experience. We write them in our laws. We change them as a part of a dynamic process in the face of the living king, the living conduit, so to speak, to that divine order. That they can see the patterns of society like nobody else can, and they are afforded this opportunity by which they can tap into that mode of reflection, that level or layer of reflection, such that their ordering, their bringing together, is unique, because it's only the position of one person that can satisfy such a task. Now, my personal difficulty with my reflection thus far is on the standard that the visitor sets. And I suppose it's not really a difficulty with what he's saying, but rather a conceptual difficulty, a matter of possibility. Now, I understand that, and this is something that has been said before, that there have been plenty of periods throughout history for which a central figure has had a large effect on the trajectory of a society, of a civilization. And their presence is likely due to a combination of factors. Their abilities may exist commonly in many men that exist in a particular period, but only one is in the position to actually capitalize or to execute those abilities appropriately. The position matters. So almost similar to what we were talking about before, we have in terms of coming to understand something. We have that which is, in due measure, the thing that outlines, describes, gives form to or shape to the identity of the thing, and then the position of the identity relative to other things. Now, going back to thinking about laws, considering them as memories, considering the general state of affairs of man, how his standard political institutions operate, how full of flaws they happen to be. It is in many cases, both in terms of the lineage-based, or maybe I should say, the inheritance-based knowledge, and the dynamic, lived understanding or knowledge, that they are both exposed to falsehood. They are exposed to the limitations of mind as they encounter identities and identify, or at least attempt to identify, the relations of that thing to some other thing. Now, to the extent that we can have something that is good, or a good written rule, the visitor is describing the monarchy as the best of all. So we have to think about what it would mean on that civilizational level for there to be good written rules, and then to think about why it would be most effective or most desired to have the monarch. So the first question, what in a society, what perhaps as expressed on the individual level, would be the utmost satisfying experience, or the most harmonious experience? And as I can tell, or as I have experienced, one thing that comes to mind is a greater sense of shared community, a shared common sense, and not just common sense in terms of reason in solving problems, but sense in the sense of experience, ontological orientation. I think that there is a shared standard by the fact that we are all human and we share it in a particular type of experience, but we all understand that psychology is complex. It involves many factors. The software that we are brought up with often gives us more tools than just the base human experience. And it's by a desire for the harmony, but also the homogeneous nature of these tools that I think creates a stronger, cohesive whole, a collective. It is often said these days that difference is a strength. And difference is only really a strength if the particular unification has been turned into a tyranny, for which there is an inherent negative. There's a deficit that is running on the part of the governor and the governed, and that it is only a matter of time before either the light of that civilization is diminished because of it, or that tyrant is overthrown. And so it's sort of a transitional stability, that strength and difference. But it is not something that is permanent, or rather resistant to change. It is something that is a phase transition. It doesn't follow it through at all. And so there's number one. That is the psychotechnological tools that promote harmony and unification. A commonality of them. The second would be more of a, well, perhaps related, but separate in terms of action. It would be more of an economic desire. And the point here would be that what is desired is a particular ratio. And exactly how it breaks down can be kind of difficult to approach, but I think most fundamentally it would have something to do with time that is spent with relation to attention and material prosperity. And so, with the interrelatedness of these things, we would want our time and attention to afford us a particular quality of life. And although material circumstances will only get us so far in terms of satisfaction, a certain base level, I think, is appropriate for man to be satisfied. And culturally, there is variability here, because therein lies, I think, difficult distinctions about the orientation of mind, about what one considers just, what one considers selfish, and that considerable variability is enough to throw a bit of a wrench in that potential equation, for which, if we are trying to discuss harmony and the relationship that good laws have to the effect on society, it can be kind of difficult to determine. For there's a certain amount of established law that does not penetrate the depth of man. There's a certain amount of it that is just left to his relationship with God. But I also suspect that as a person that is living in a democracy in the year 2025, or what is left of a Republican democracy, I can appreciate and can recognize that a monarch would have a greater impact, I think, on my psychological orientation. I still maintain that personal relationship with God, but as far as more personal matters that the state now does not touch, I would wish that a certain standard of excellence was required on the part of the apparatus of society. Now, I guess it can exist across all of them, but as far as it can be directed by the monarch, I would wish that my failures would be less easily hid behind, I should say. And that in a properly ordered society, perhaps, there would be no opportunity, or ontologically there would be no view to be so inattentive and perhaps absent. And as a free person, sometimes that seduction into absence can be quite powerful. especially given certain market forces. So now from the visitor's perspective, he considers this aristocratic or oligarchic form of governance to be somewhere in the middle between that of one, of the monarch, and that of the many, of a democracy. And so we don't spend too much time here, because when we reflect on the democracy and the monarch, we cover all of the intermediate data points. So of democracy, of the many, we are to reflect on this idea that it is weak and that it is incapable of anything important, either for good or for bad. So there's an aspect of impotence that is attributed to it. And this is in part because the office is distributed into small parts. And by this office, we refer to a position of authority, a position of responsibility. And by dividing all of these things up, we necessarily reduce the height of that observation post, which is an observatory and information collector about the relations among different aspects of society. When we reduce all of this, we reduce the view, perhaps within the tree line. And so what is immediate to one office is not entirely clear to the next. Now, we could see that this doesn't afford a look at the whole. So on one hand, the failure of one office is not as impactful as the failure of the primary office if it is singular at the top. And also, we have the possibility that each individual office can participate with other offices, and this collective participation can yield something approaching a type of order by convenience. Now, convenience may not be the standard by which we have a healthy and effective society, so it may not inherently be stable. On the other hand, well, maybe not on the other hand, but we can imagine that this place of multiplicity can be reduced in number, so to speak, such that it reflects more of the common experience, the American common experience, or maybe broadly the Western common experience with representative government. And we don't necessarily have pure democracies. We don't have aristocracies. We have sort of a type of oligarchy, but republican in its elements. There's still value placed on elections and who gets elected. The government still has power. The democratic government, Republican government, still has power in that respect. But of the power that can be given to the many, I think there are various forms that this can take. The Republican form is still distributed, but still also highly central. And the fact that the amount of people that represent the whole is quite small, but they still carry the voice of the whole. We can also imagine a scenario in which it is a little bit more direct. Governance is a little bit more direct, in which the whole is constantly voting on each individual thing, or having a voice or a say in each individual thing. And this, I think, is actually much different than having it concentrated on a representative. Moreover, from that, in our system, we have an executive, which is very concentrated. It is one to rule all. Of course, that power is checked by others, the powers that write the laws, the powers that judge the laws, and the powers that that execute, lead, And all of this is, I think, a step away from that pure democracy, let's say, the direct democracy. And I bring this up because I think that it means that this distribution of power, or the centralization of power rather, is something of a correcting mechanism to that which we might find in the poverty of a direct democratic situation, because of what the visitor is proposing, that of the limited view of the multitude. And by this limited view, no solid understanding of order really emerges. Now, in one way, we can see that there is a problem here, because the markets work quite well to regulate themselves. At least they can. If one problem emerges, especially a large monopoly, that can be a problem for the market. It can destroy the market. And so there needs to be a hand that comes in to keep it mobile, dynamic, and fluid. And so I think we can see by degrees how necessarily the absence of such a hand in the extreme would lead to quite extreme, well, maybe not extreme, but it would lead to a reordering in a particular way. And this ordering, I think, would eventually lead to something quite central, like a monarchy. Not immediately, of course, but over time, we would have these periods of centralization and decentralization. The visitor says, for this reason, again, the reason being the offices being distributed in small portions among many people. For this reason, if all types of constitutions are law-abiding, it turns out to be the worst of them. But if all are contrary to law, the best. So, we have the two constitutions, the monarchy that works well in good standing law, and we have the distributed sense, the multitude governance. It is the case that if these are to be law-abiding, then it is to be the worst. But if contrary, then the best. Now, an interesting reflection, perhaps. We have to imagine why that is. So we must ask ourselves the question, why is it the case that in a majority governance, in a democratic constitution, why is it that when the laws are strong, when the laws are abided, that this form of government is poor? So on one hand, we have to reflect on the establishment of these laws, where they come from. Are they born of the democratic institutions, or are they born of a different institution and passed down to a democratic polity? In the case of the United States, much of our history of common law has been passed down through institutions that are highly centralized, through monarchies. And I have to wonder about this situation, because what it afforded us was a particular type of stability, law that had again come from a a society in which they were ruled by a sovereign for many hundreds of years. And by that, we have inherited precedent over time, laws that have been shaped by the pressure of that system. Some of the laws we have decided to keep, some of them we've decided to remove and get rid of. But if we started from a point zero and had the collective suddenly design laws, what we would have are laws that would be so minuscule and individualized that the order that it would produce would be so chaotic but also stagnant, because there would be so much underbrush, so to speak, or so much vinage in the way of individual movement, that it would be, one, unenforceable, but also impractical. And by that, the order of law, the authority of law, would have very little hold and very little sway. And I have to wonder if, in our situation, law would not just sort of devolve into that sort of space in time, given enough years, hundreds of years. Or if the semi-centralized institutions are enough to maintain that force of law, like our executive branch, our legislative and judicial, etc. Now, on the flip side of that, he says, but if the society is contrary to the laws, it is the best type of system. And this would have to be the converse of what we said. If there's no ordering structure, the identity is left to the part. The part becomes the primary identity. The law becomes local to that heart. And the way in which the person is governed is not by obeying some standard by the sovereign, but rather by one's own ontological expression. This could be either good or bad. It doesn't aim towards, it may if it is inherited, but it doesn't inherently aim towards the goodness of one or the badness of the other. Personal interest, rather than cosmic order, is primary in this case. Now, there's a further point, and perhaps a point of clarification that is necessary here, in the sense that it's not that individuality is bad, nor that self-preference is bad, but rather the due measure of identity is limited or poorly corrected in the pluralistic system. Of course, we can obviously see dangers in both, of the singular and of the plural. But I think it could be said of the plural that its self-corrective mechanisms may be slower than that of the destructive. So today happens to be a new day, and it's a good day, despite the inclinations of heart. I had a getaway weekend. I took Friday off and spent the weekend in another state, renting a house. And now today is Sunday evening, and I return to this now. It's been a long time since I've taken a number of days off from recording. And like I say, it felt good to take that break. But now I return to it, understanding that this is something that is necessary, something that I need to devote my attention to. And so I'd like to get right back into this. So I listened to the last bit of recording to refresh myself and where I was at. And so I'd like to continue in this light. I may go over some previously covered territory again, but that's the nature of a new day. Now, the visitor says, for this reason, if all the types of constitution are law-abiding, it turns out to be the worst of them, that being sort of the collective democracy. But if all are contrary to law, the best. And if all are uncontrolled, living in a democracy takes the prize. But if they are ordered, life in it is least livable. And in first place, and best by far, will be life in the first, except for the seventh. Okay. So, I think about the early American experience with his Republican democracy. In that environment, that form of government seemed to be afforded well. There was an abundance of land on the horizon, and by that there was a lot of disorder to be subdued into some order. What they brought with them was an order of a type. They brought with them the Protestant religion, which kept them oriented to each other, oriented to God. They also took with them common law, and they developed a new structure that did not entirely abandon the centralized constitution. It kept, by large measure, that centralized constitution, for we have a federal government, and we have our states. And we are not a direct democracy. We are a republic that, of course, has democratic elements. Necessarily it must. And by this, we retain, I think, a degree of order. But the point is surely taken, especially in days not too long past, for which our disharmony has become apparent, and the sways of psychological warfare have no problem finding a home. In every single one of our minds, I think we are plagued by this intestine faction, and it's difficult to overcome, being so prevalent everywhere that we see it. And it's something that is rife, fertile ground for conspiracy, given that so many things are uncertain. And there does seem to be a hunger for a return to order and to common sense making, which would of course depend on that order to be reestablished. And so it's not a simple situation. The individual experiences often have these subtleties that are worth reflecting on. A multitude that is sort of intermixed with centralization, or a multitude, let's say, of governance that is mixed with a certain type of centralization of governance in an attempt to facilitate the desires of many. This sort of thing was unknown to Plato and people of his era, but all the same, I have to expect Maybe not. About 800 BC, we have this steady progression of the Roman monarchy and the subsequent Republican era, as we are given by Livy. And in the Greek states, democracy and these intermittent periods of dictatorship that often can be willfully elected in cases of profound instability or war, where that highly centralized mode of mobilization is required. The visitor continues, he says, "For all of them, that one we must separate out from the other constitutions, like God from men." So this is the seventh that he's talking about. Young Socrates says, "This seems both to follow and to be, as you say, and we must do as you suggested." The visitor, "So then we must also remove those who participate in all these constitutions, except for the one based on knowledge, as being not statesmen, but experts in faction. We must say that, as presiding over insubstantial images, on the largest scale, they are themselves of the same sort, and that as the greatest imitators and magicians, they turn out to be the greatest sophists among sophists." Young Socrates says, "This term sophist looks as if it has been only too correctly turned round against the so-called experts in statesmanship. So, this is our play, as it were. As we said just now, that there was some band of centaurs and satyrs in view, one that we had to set apart from the expertise of the statesman, and now it has been set apart, as we have seen with great difficulty." It appears so. Yes, but there is something else remaining that is still more difficult than this, by reason of its being more akin to the kingly class, and closer to it, and harder to understand, and we seem to me to be in a situation similar to that of those who refine gold. How so? I imagine that these craftsmen also begin by separating out earth and stones, and many different things, and after these there remain commingled with the gold those things that are akin to it, precious things, and only removable with the use of fire, copper, silver, and sometimes adamant, the removal of which through repeated smelting and testing leaves the unalloyed gold that people talk about there is for us to see, itself alone by itself. Yes, they certainly do say these things happen in this way. Well, it seems that in the same way we have now separated off those things that are different from the expert knowledge of statesmanship, and those that are alien and hostile to it, and that there remain those that are precious and related to it. Among these, I think, are generalship, the art of the judge, and that part of rhetoric which in partnership with kingship persuades people of what is just, and so helps in steering through the business of cities. As for these, in what way will one most easily portion them off and show, stripped and alone by himself, that person we are looking for? So let's pause here. We sort of had a little bit of a reprieve, and then there was another recognition that we've made some decent progress and cuts that have gotten closer to the heart of the matter, but still we have some work to do. Now, what's important to reflect on here is those that remain precious and related to it. The generalship, art of the judge, part of rhetoric, which in partnership with kingship persuades people of what is just and helps steer through the business of cities. Now we have to remember the position of the statesman or of the king, what their responsibilities are. And going back to our weaving analogy, they are putting together pieces or parts of society. They are not necessarily outlining identities, but they have some role to play in the outlining of identities. It's more in the relation of the identities that they are concerned. Now there's some language here that would fall by the wayside if there was not some further clarification. And that is to be said, if the statesman or the king is to primarily rest his authority on the sort of fluid dynamics that exist between parts, that exist between individuals, or exist between institutions, of course made up of individuals, then I think we would miss something, especially given what we were speaking about before, with regard to what the visitor was saying about how direct things sometimes have to be in order to resolve an internal pathology. So, for example, capital punishment would be one. So, in considering the king, at the very least, we understand him to be sovereign and the head of the whole. And so all of the parts are participating up towards him, which is an interesting type of organization. Because on one hand, it gives him a massive amount of authority. That authority, we have spoken of earlier, has been mixed throughout the ages, has been balanced by certain political parties or ecclesiastical faction. And having one precise definition of kingly institutional structure is difficult, because it's a form that, or it's a identity that shifts. So with this in mind, with the king or even the statesman as the head, somebody that's responsible for putting forth or producing the harmony among the parts, we have to think that among the whole, if the surface area for the boundary of particular identities become increasingly antagonistic to each other, that there are only very small pieces of their borders that it can actually relate to one another, then it would be very difficult to order that, first of all. It'd be very difficult to maintain a cohesive society or to have common sense. And so within that vibratory field that's underneath, that disposes the identities to farther conglomeration, I think the king and the statesman have a role to play there. So in the first instance, when I said that the king or the statesman doesn't have anything to do with identity, I think that that's wrong. Okay, so what Plato is bringing forth here almost, it seems quite familiar with regard to our own constitution and how our government is split up. So the first is we have the generalship. Now the generalship is an extension of the statesman or of the king, we have to remember. And he is primarily responsible for maintaining external order. Now, what do I mean by that? The general is often concerned with affairs of a faction as it relates to the broad identity, not necessarily the parts, although he can be involved in the parts given a significant insurrection or something, but usually it's between competing large-scale identities, like two kingdoms, for example. And so his movement in that sphere is maintaining a defense against harm from external chaos and maintaining that boundary of stability that is around all of these different parts of the society. Then we have the judge, who I think is responsible for the internal order of the society. This is the individual or group of individuals that decide on cases. They make determinations on which case that is presented is right versus which is wrong. And by this, there's a standard certainly set into place. There's a method that is set into place by which one comes to understand what is right, what is wrong, or what is true, and what is false. All of that lies within the judge's domain. And when conflicts appear, I think it takes a good judge to determine the rightfulness of a dispute and to establish precedent. And it's often this precedent that carries over into our next, the part of rhetoric, which in partnership with the king persuades people of what is just and helps steer through the business of cities. And in this, I think of the legislator. Of course, in concert with the king, I think of the sovereign in this case referring to the parliament in more of a, at least in the context of the stricter monarchies, when the parliament was there for essentially an advisory role and to give voice to those that they represent. But in all actuality, their authority remained minimal in the strong monarchical periods. But nevertheless, I think this advice and this deliberation on the part of a parliament comes up with the rough outline, sort of the sketches for law that is to be maintained or may come to be based on precedent. The visitor says, "As for these, in what way will one most easily portion them off and show, stripped and alone by himself, the person that we are looking for?" Now, of these, we identify things that are closely related to him, like those metals that are attached to gold, for example, that have yet to go through a stronger refining process. And it's not as though these things that are mentioned are outside of the statesman's scope. They're an extension. It's almost like a continuation of a particular type of authority, at least when it comes to the king. This is true. Young Socrates says, "It's clear that we must try to do this somehow." The visitor says, "Well, if it depends on our trying, we'll find him. Music will help us reveal him. Answer me this. What? I imagine we recognize such a thing as the learning of music, and in general the sorts of expert knowledge involving work with the hands. We do. And what of this? The matter of whether we should learn any one of these or not. Shall we say that this too, in its turn, is a sort of knowledge concerned with these very things? Or what shall we say? Yes, we'll say that it is. Then shall we agree that this sort of knowledge is distinct from those? Yes. And shall we agree that no one of them should control any other, or that the other should control this one, or that this one should manage and control all the others together? Young Socrates says, this one should control them. In that case, you, at any rate, declare it to be your opinion that the one that decides whether one should learn or not should be in control, so far as we are concerned, over the one that is the object of learning and does the teaching? Very much so, says young Socrates. And also, in that case, that the one which decides whether one should persuade or not should control the one which is capable of persuading? Of course. Well then, to which sort of expert knowledge shall we assign what is capable of persuading mass and crowd, through the telling of stories and not through teaching? This too is clear, I think. It must be given to rhetoric. And the matter of whether to do through persuasion, whatever it may be in relation to some people or other, or else by the use of some sort of force, or indeed to do nothing at all, to what sort of expert knowledge shall we attach this? To the one that controls the art of persuasion and speaking. This would be none other, I think, than the capacity of the statesman. So it seems what we have here is like sort of an is-ought type of situation. The is in this respect is the expertise, the practical expertise, the one that can do the persuading, the one that has the knowledge of music and that can teach it, and all sorts of other things. The ought is what seems to be the statesman's domain, which is the direction of what practical things ought to be learned, what the persuader ought to be utilized in persuading. Now, the expert knowledge that young Socrates says that shall be used in persuading mass and crowd through the telling of stories is rhetoric. And so I want to go through the etymology of that word. So from ancient Greek we have a meaning the art of the speaker. It derives from the word rhetor, which means public speaker or orator, especially one skilled in civic or political discourse. So the root verb ero, the future of lego, meaning to speak or to say. So it is one who speaks. The art of oratory or eloquence. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'm going to go back to the traditional way of presenting this material by reading 2 pages and then returning to reflect and interpret. So young Socrates says, "Very well said." The visitor, "This matter of rhetoric, too, seems to have been separated quickly from statesmanship, as a distinct class, but subordinate to it." Yes. What should we think about the following sort of capacity in its turn? Which one? The one that decides how to make war against each group of people against whom we choose to make war. The question is whether we shall say that this is or is not a matter of expertise. And how could we suppose it not to involve expertise? That capacity which is exercised by generalship and all activity concerned with war. And are we to understand as different from this the expertise that is able and knows how to reach a considered decision about whether we should make war or whether we should withdraw in a friendly fashion? Or are we to take it to be the same as this one? Anyone who was following what was said just before must suppose that it is distinct. Shall we then declare our view that it controls it, if in fact we are going to make things in line with what we said before? I say yes, says young Socrates. Then what mistress will we even try to propose for so terrifying and important an expertise? The whole of that concerned with war, except the true art of kingship. No other. In that case, we shall not set down the expert knowledge of generals as statesmanship, since it is subordinate. It seems unlikely that we shall. Come on, then. Let's look at the capacity that belongs to those judges who judge correctly. Absolutely. Well then, does its capacity extend to anything more than taking over from the legislator king all those things that are established as lawful in relation to contracts, and judging by reference to these things that had been prescribed as just and unjust, providing its own individual excellence by virtue of the fact that it would not be willing to decide the complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator, through being overcome by presence of some sort, or fears, or feelings of compassion, or again by any enmity of friendship? Young Socrates says no, the function of this capacity extends, roughly speaking, to what you have said. In that case, we discover the power of judges, too, not to be that belonging to the king, but to be a guardian of the laws and subordinate of that other capacity. It seems so, at any rate. If then one looks at all sorts of expert knowledge that have been discussed, it must be observed that none of them has been declared to be statesmanship. For what is really kingship must not itself perform practical tasks, but control those with the capacity to perform them, because it knows when it is the right time to begin and set in motion the most important things in cities, and when it is the wrong time. And the others must do what has been prescribed for them. Correct. For this reason, then, the sorts of expertise we have just examined control neither each other nor themselves, but each is concerned with some individual practical activity of its own, and in accordance with the individual nature of the activities in question, has appropriately acquired a name that is individual to it. That seems so, at any rate. Whereas the one that controls all of these, and the laws, and cares for every aspect of things in the city, weaving everything together in the most correct way, this, embracing its capacity with the appellation belonging to the whole, we would, it seems, most appropriately call statesmanship. Yes, absolutely. At this point we'll want, won't we, to pursue it further by reference to the model of the art of weaving, now that all the classes of things in the city have become clear to us. Yes, very much so. Then it seems that we should discuss the intertwining that belongs to kingship, of what kind it is, and in what way it intertwines to render us what sort of fabric. Clearly. what it seems we have to deal with in that case is certainly a difficult thing to show. But in any case, we have to discuss it, says young Socrates. To say that part of virtue is in a certain sense different in kind from virtue provides an all too easy target for those expert in disputing statements, if we view things in relation to what the majority of people think. I don't understand. I'll put it again, like this. I imagine you think that courage, for us, constitutes one part of virtue. Certainly. And also that moderation is something distinct from courage, but at the same time, that is one part of what the other is part of. Yes. Well, we must take our courage in our hands and declare something astonishing in relation to these two. So that marks the end of these 2 pages. Okay, so here I want to back up a little bit because I think it's important. We've established a thought among the following. We've identified that there is broad sets, or broad categories of expertise. We've identified that there's quite narrow sets of expertise. We can say, just as the visitor said on the previous page, I imagine we recognize such a thing as the learning of music, and in general of the sorts of expert knowledge involving work with the hands. A strange statement, but I think it's telling about where we are meant to go. And within the possibilities, within the broad set of things for which we have to make some decision, there is an ought somewhere in that decision-making process. The matter of whether we should learn any of these or not. This mattering is a type of knowledge. And here we begin to see the separation from the one above, the statesman, that looks down on some of these established orders of expertise, let's say. And in the looking down, the engineer, perhaps, the classic example in my mind is the engineer that has particular technical knowledge, but is poor on the front of wisdom and strategic integration. They design some tool, and they care not about how it is applied. But in this case, we're also thinking about what precedes that. We're thinking about how one comes to be a knower or an expert of anything practical or technical. And on top of this, we are considering that person that is responsible for delegating the ought, or perhaps influencing the ought, however that relationship might come to be. The point is that the expert of directing the mind on what object to attend to is within the realm of the statesman. And then we, on the previous page again, we get into this idea that the statesman is an expert in persuasion. Because necessarily one must have to have some sort of expert knowledge in persuasion to move into this territory of what one ought to do with the sole rigor of their attentive faculties. And of course this can dip into sophistry, and so there's danger there. But it is also clear that in a righteous manner, and in the righteous way that rhetoric can be expressed, the statesman is on that side of it. So that brings us to the 2 pages that I just read. Now the visitor says, this matter of rhetoric too seems to have been separated quickly from statesmanship, as a distinct class, but subordinate to it. Now what's interesting is, perhaps I missed it, but I explained it in the sense that it almost seems that it has to be the case that rhetoric is not the sole capacity of the statesman. And this subordination is a necessity precisely because if we are talking about justice and that which is true, the realm of the sophist, and being a persuasive master himself, he cannot rest within this domain or share within the civic responsibility of the statesman. So then we go through the close associations that were mentioned before. We start with the generalship, the one that decides how to make war against each group of people against whom we choose to make war. Now, certainly we say that it's a matter of expertise, but this matter of expertise, much like learning music, is a matter of a technical pursuit, and one is to be directed into that domain. Now, the direction of the one that goes into this is higher. It is from a place of strategy, of positioning, and of understanding of the interrelatedness among things. Not that the general is not responsible for a degree of that, but at the level of purpose, they are subordinate. So there's a higher purpose that the general participates in. Now, I suppose it's worth reflecting, and this has been mentioned before on the previous page, that we made this distinction between the object, or the sort of technical expertise of a person, and that of the one who directs the person towards expertise. And there is this assumption that the statesman is not a technical expert of sorts. He's, I suppose, technical in the sense that he's the expert civil weaver, so to speak. But he does not possess that technical expertise of the general or of the judge. And so the question becomes, can the statesman go to war? Like the king or what have you. And I think that necessarily man is limited in this regard. Now the argument I make is not very sophisticated, but it seems that it would make sense to delegate responsibility. And that expertise, although the capacity varies based on the individual, and there may be some generals that are better than others, there may be some people that can hold within their minds the information of a field or two, but the time and the effort that it takes to execute well one discipline, I think, it signifies or classifies an expert. And surely the statesman would have some knowledge of the generalship and have some knowledge of the judge, but they don't consume themselves in the solving of these problems. It is for the subordinates to do so. The subordinates participate in the purpose that the statesman is putting forth. And I think the visitor says this well when he says, "And are we to understand as different from this the expertise that is able and knows how to reach a considered decision about whether we should make war, or whether we should withdraw in friendly fashion, or are we to take it to be the same as this one?" And young Socrates follows up and says it's distinct. And it's distinct for good reason, because this is the ought of what one should do. It is not the technical art of performing the object, which is the generalship or the waging of war. He says, then, shall we then declare it our view that it controls it? So it being the statesman, or this ideal form, and the other it controls it, would be the generalship. He continues, he says, then what mistress will we even try to propose for so terrifying and important an expertise? The whole of that concerned with war, except the true art of kingship. Now, at this point, I find this interesting because there seems to be an interrelationship, maybe not quite name swapping, but there's this interrelatedness between the king and the statesman. Now, before in this dialogue, we've discussed how the king is imitative, that the king is a step down from the divine. Often they are seen as this conduit, or I guess a conduit, through which information flows from the divine to the people and from the people to the divine. We've discussed the close relationship that the priestly class had with the king. We've also talked about how it is possible for somebody to hold the office, but not the expertise, and how this might be separated out into the role of the tyrant versus the king. I think we've also discussed that potentiality for anybody understanding at the expertise of the statesman, of being a weaver. And by this expertise and the expertise alone, would they be able to fill that responsibility? So, in some sense, what we're talking about here is not the literal ruler, or rather I should say the physical ruler of the king. He speaks of the true art of kingship. Now, the art of kingship is a step up. It is a formal distinction. It's something that can be participated in, much like statesmanship is something can be participated in. This kingly archetype is something that orders being itself. And then we have our step down from the arts. We have the true statesman, weaving civic harmony. The statesmen participate in divine order through their understanding. And then the king, as we've discussed before, is a step down in the sense that they rule by law, what is given to them, by custom and opinion. They imitate the form. They do this well or poorly, depending on how their rule is. And so we come to this conclusion that we cannot set down expert knowledge of generals as statesmanship because it is subordinate to it. Now, today is a new day. It is a Tuesday evening. And the thought that comes to mind before I jump back into this is the importance of register, or what level or what layer we were talking about. Even the very idea of a layer or a register is important to make explicit. Now, sometimes I have difficulty getting myself up to speed in this regard. I know that I have opinions about these matters, but sometimes they are buried deeply in memory, and it takes my reason time to catch up. And that can result in some lost productive ground, but I suppose it's never a loss if I'm going back and exploring something that's worthwhile, fundamental, useful, whatever the case is. So going back to this idea of register and layering, I think of this y-axis, the vertical, upon which rests the ordering of being. Now, man is, of course, a big part of this. Given that I am one, it must be ranked here. We have above man the divine. As far as formal distinctions are concerned, I may be incorrect in the traditional philosophical school, but just as far as a personal organization is concerned, it's going to be important to separate out this kingly archetype, or rather the art of kingship, from that of the actual king, which is a step down from that in that register. And so what does it mean then if we were going to separate these two out, if one is to be that step down? Well, the step down king is to be not necessarily a statesman, but one that is concerned with the direction of laws, the upholding of laws as has been passed down to him. And as we've said before, the law holds this sort of memory-like quality. In certain instances, it may not be appropriate because the relations among things change. In certain instances, it may need to be rediscovered. That is, the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. This is a common expression. It is something that is constantly changing by different events that occur, that reveal to us different insights, some better than others. And again, we separate out the tyrant from the king. So poor lawmaking, while it may occur under the leadership of a human king, I want to say that the tyrant is almost exclusively involved in the production of bad law, to procure power for himself, but also to satisfy his own desires. It is less about the harmony of the different registers. So we have this king, the human king, fallible and all the rest. Above him, we have what I would call the statesman, and this is that semi-formal but also potentially human arena in which we have a living, rational, embodied law, so to speak. And this is something that requires, as a prerequisite, wisdom and knowledge, that expertise of the statesman. And that, of course, has to do with the weaving of being, I would say. The weaving of intelligibility, the weaving of identity. It matters less, I think, in terms of the creation of identity, but rather the facilitation of proper orientation. Above this, we have the mythical king, or we could say maybe the art of kingship. But what comes to mind here is Kronos, a divine mover that occupies this ordered realm that is beyond human experience, but at the same time it filters down to his experience. It is beyond his experience in the sense that as a human being in the human form, he cannot participate in that level of ordering, or rather responsibility. He can participate in the ordering given the level that he is at, given the expanse of being that he possesses, and the creative and productive potentials that are within his grasp. So I think we'll set this as it stands as sort of a tentative conceptual map of this layering, ontological layering. So next, the thing to discuss is the judge and his place. And I think that this paragraph here, while I'm not completely certain, I think it probably will reveal to us certain things about the nature of the legislature and what the judge is exactly responsible for. And it might help us with this register, adding to the register of being. So the visitor says, let's look at the capacity that belongs to those judges who judge correctly. He asks, does its capacity extend to anything more than taking over from the legislator king, and all those things that are established as lawful in relation to contracts? Okay, so the first thing is to think about the legislator king. So this is something that we haven't seen before. It is a new distinction, but nonetheless it helps us orient our minds to what this is. Now, obviously, the legislator king is different from the art of kingship. And the legislator king perhaps participates in the art of kingship. So the legislator king, without going into the etymology of legislate or legislator, I think from a common understanding, we understand a legislator to be somebody that writes the laws, somebody with an executive responsibility is one that enforces the laws, and in a judicial capacity, one that decides on the rightfulness of it, the truthfulness of claims, and this sort of thing. The legislative power seems to me to be a substantial one, because within this realm we have certain possibilities. We have the possibility for there to exist the statesman king, let's say, the living law, the embodiment of law. We have the type of basic legislator king who may not be considered this living law, but rather one that facilitates a pre-existing law and decide on certain things that are relevant given a particular period and the series of events that occur in that period. So just so we have some more formal etymological description, the word legislator comes from the Latin lex, which means law, from the Latin verb latus, the past participle of fere, to bear, carry, or bring forth, formed as legislator, literally the bearer or proposer of the law. So just in this, I think we are affirmed in our expression of possibility, such that both we have the one that takes under their wing the responsibility of that memory, the cultural and institutional memory, civilizational memory of the law, and the proposer, the one that has more of this intuitive grasp on what ought to be instituted, that may not exist by precedent, that may not exist in some codified sense. Now there's an interesting note here in classical Latin from 100 BCE to 200 CE. Legislator referred to someone who instituted or enacted laws, such as Solon or Lycurgus or Numa Pompilius. Those considered lawgivers who founded or reformed constitutions. So in Middle English, 14th to 15th century, we have more of what we would expect of the term, as we use it today, legislator, referring to one who frames or enacts laws, either as a founder, as Moses or Solon, or as a part of a legislative body. Now let's say we consider a legislator king that has these elements of statesmanship. So they have a certain embodiment of productivity, ingenuity, creativity. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that there's a certain responsibility, obviously. This responsibility is the production of something new. But all the same, just as we can reflect on something that is new in terms of order and law, we can also reflect on how something old has come to be. And both of these, I think, have similar roots. They are similar seeds planted in similar soil. They come from observation. They come from a certain knowledge and expertise of the ordering of things. Order here is fundamental. And while, certainly from my perspective, it is difficult to see exactly how all things are connected, how all things are related, and not to lose that ground of divine being in all of it. The cosmological centerpiece is the project of many religious and wise people to come to understand something that puts the mind at ease and allows for a more peaceable existence. But nonetheless, if we can say anything fundamental about the laws, I think it is that they are there to give us sort of a hypothesis, but also potentially the results of some experiment on a broad scale, again, thinking cosmologically here, that grabs onto a certain thread or a through line of order that exists in all things. But though it exists in all things, it is not expressed the same. And I think since it is not expressed the same, it is not observed or perceived the same, unless the connections are made. So in a broad sense, an example of this would be some material causality and something more purposeful in the subjective domain in man's experience. In the contemporary age, we have had much difficulty reconciling material causality with something that is purposeful. Now, my apologies, I'm sort of fighting off a cold, so sometimes this congestion gets to me. Okay, so where are we? So we just finished talking about this legislator king. And the ways in which the laws are this reflection of, or at least an attempt at a reflection, and so, in some instances well-formed, in others not so much, but it is an attempt to remember the divine order that led to the creation of all things, including us. And of that, what matters most to us is our belonging, our loves, our desires, our orientation of all of these things. And of course, within nature, or within the minutiae of nature, it's difficult for us to draw parallels to these things. But they are there, nonetheless. Order exists in many domains. Purposeful, all the same. So again, the visitor says, does its capacity extend to anything more than taking over the legislator king all those things that are established as lawful in relation to contracts, and judging by reference to these things that have been prescribed as just and unjust? So, this word contracts, immediately the mind goes to some agreement. If I have a contract, then I have committed to a certain relationship. It is bound by law. It is bound by that order. It is something that is enforceable because it is bound in that way. And so there's a certain amount of trust and confidence that can be gathered by a relationship that is set by a contract. So what does this taking over mean on the part of the judge from the legislator king? Well, the judge takes the laws that have been written and what has been prescribed, as the visitor says, as just and unjust, and they make a decision or some determination. Now, in terms of power, I certainly think that the legislator has an important responsibility, but in terms of decision and the weight that is assumed therein, the judge has no easy responsibility. And the exercise of that authority is something of the utmost responsibility. Now the visitor continues, he says, providing its own individual excellence by virtue of the fact that it would not be willing to decide the complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator through being overcome by presence of some sort. So the idea here is that there is an adherence to the laws as they are written. So that helps his case a little bit, his authority, because there's this distributed sense in which he sort of has a cookie-cutter understanding of where justice may rest based on the form and the structure of the law, the order of the law. But in his state of excellence, in his state of expertise, it is for him to focus on that and that alone, that decision, or of coming to an understanding, again, a decision about what the law says relative to a particular insult or breach of contract. Now here I think it's important to recognize that contracts may not necessarily be signed and written. And what do I mean by that? I mean to get myself out of the thought that everything is sort of a lease agreement, or everything is sort of a corporate agreement, that these services are for this term and the remuneration will be for this amount. I think the contract, in the sense that we are talking about here, is much larger. There's a concept of the social contract. There is an idea that man in his relationship to his society is a type of agreement and a type of relationship. And while he may be ordered by the laws, it is not as though he has agreed, in any strict sense, that when he is born that he must sign some form by which he agrees to behave. It is ingrained in him. It's something of law that I don't think we appreciate as much. It is something that is expected of him. It is something that he comes to understand of how he should be in relationship to his fellows, and there's no shortage of these types of contracts. I think we could begin quite general, and it can cover a lot of territory, certainly, but there are so many different things that I can think about that I know that I am governed by, that throughout my daily experience I don't really think much about those restrictions on my behaviors, just because I have a certain orientation. It aligns me for the most part with the laws, and I don't run up against them. And by saying this, it brings to mind the importance of having a well-written law and a well-harmonized vertical. So to restate this, the judge's responsibility, as far as his excellence is concerned, as the visitor describes, is not to input himself. Now, what do I mean by that? What would it mean necessarily to input one's own opinion? I'm looking at what the visitor's words are here. He says, providing its own individual excellence by virtue of the fact that it would not be willing to decide the complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator through being overcome by whatever. So regardless of what he says about what particular things might overcome him, like presence or fears or feelings or compassions, we can think about personal motivations. And we can consider what the implications of those personal motives are. And there are so many situations that one can think of. One can think of a corrupt law in which the tyrant has written, but the judge is responsible for upholding. What then in that case? Is the judge not an expert to go outside of the law? And this is the conversation that we had before about the Statesman. I think, in some sense, it could be said that it is not the responsibility of the judge to go outside and to detach himself from the law for which he is tasked with upholding. So it would be a sort of a betrayal of his expertise. Now, we can all understand that the betrayal of this sort of thing would be good, and it would be not necessarily a good thing to say that the judge maintains his expertise in this situation by not doing the good. But all the same, looking at the statesman, or the one that comes to be as a sort of principled, intuitive type that introduces this radical change and transformation, it is his responsibility to change this, because he is the head of the river, so to speak. What he dictates flows downstream and affects all. And while it may be a nice thing to think about that all of the layers below suddenly recognize where the faults of their participation are and betray for a short period their expertise, nothing would change unless the top ordering was changed. And this, I think, would either happen by violent revolution or by willful decree from the higher orders of society. And now that I think about it, I consider a sort of a grassroots cultural change. And I'm not sure exactly how this would affect the higher orders. It would procure from them a certain type of consent, surely, which is possible to be nonviolent. But nonetheless, the consent would be necessary. And if it is resisted, then it would be violent. But if it is consented, then whether by coercion or by true conversion, there will be a change in the orientation of that society. So I want to read this last part again because I think it's important. He covers a lot of ground, surprisingly. Providing its own individual excellence by virtue of the fact that it would not be willing to decide the complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator, through being overcome by presence of some sort, or fears or feelings of compassion, or again by any enmity or friendship. The visitor continues and he says, in that case we discover the power of the judges too, not to be that belonging to the king, but to be a guardian of the laws and a subordinate of that other capacity. So this is quite an important distinction. And for my part and for my learning, I wish that I had this type of reflection when I was younger, because it would help me a lot to understand the relationship among the institutions of our own governing structure, even though it is currently in disarray and it's hard to tell where the functional levers of authority actually are. But nonetheless, the judge, wherever he may find himself, is this guardian. And what I find interesting is that his responsibility is separated from the king. It is not as though it's not related, because obviously it is. The king is this legislator by which he is passing down these very solid foundations. I think of a giant marble pillar upon which are neatly engraved words expressing laws. And not just necessarily these declarative laws, but sophisticated laws that make one think about their relationship to their society. Now, this idea of the judiciary or the judge being a guardian, I think, is an interesting thing. And from my perspective, and I'm not exactly sure where this has come from, if this is something particular to the contemporary age or a personal failure of mine in my development, but there is a part of me that is quite resistant to the ordering of things. There's a high degree of this lack of trust, and I'm not sure where it comes from. I can surmise where it might come from. It could come from contemporary political concerns, or it can come from personal concerns that have to do with family life and with my upbringing and all of this sort of thing. And so I mention this because when I'm trying to put myself in the judge's shoes, I'm trying to imagine how committed and how attentive I would have, and how committed is a good word, but I don't think it really describes that sort of day-to-day experience. There's a faith that's associated with it. that of any thinking person that is inquisitive about what they do and why they do what they do, being a judge must be one of the most difficult things, because there's nothing they can do about the laws that are written. If they find some disagreement with them, they have to sacrifice that and learn how to judge appropriately. And for my part, I think, although this liberatory spirit can serve well in certain situations, it's quite limiting in others. And I could see the possibility of a very strong discipline that comes from such an expertise. Now, of course, we're talking about expertise, so I ought not to be thinking too negatively about things. The other important thing that the visitor is saying is that the judge is subordinate of that other capacity, the other capacity being the legislator king. Is the guardian of the law, but also subordinate to the expertise of the legislator king. And so this helps us in our vertical. It's a focused view of the vertical, but it is that vertical nonetheless. The visitor continues, he says, if then one looks at all the sorts of expert knowledge that have been discussed, it must be observed that none of them has been declared to be statesmanship. Now, while this is true, we've made some pretty good headway, I think, at understanding where the statesman is. Now, we're about to get back into this weaving analogy, thankfully. I've been waiting for it. But this may serve as a moment to just reflect on where we are. So again, we've come to this understanding that the statesman is a formal figure that can be expressed, I think, rather rarely in human form. And this person is the living embodiment of the law, rather than one that, as opposed to the legislator king, that observes law that is passed down to him. The statesman, the true statesman, is the one that is innovative, productive, creative, and a harmonizer. Harmonizer in terms of this vertical, bringing down divine wisdom and order and distributing it effectively among the different apparatuses of the society. In the most immediate sense, he's distributing it to perhaps the king as an advisor, I'm not really sure, but certainly to the judges if he is a king, and to the generalship and to all other closely related forms of expertise. For what is really kingship must not itself perform practical tasks, but control those with the capacity to perform them. And this is something that we've talked about before. Certainly an interesting distinction, though. So what can be said about this? I think either we are being directed to consider that kingship is this step down from statesmanship, in the sense that perhaps there's no living embodiment in kingship. I don't think this is accurate, but it's one potential road we can go down. And I say that because there is sort of an implication that the king is not doing productive things if he's not doing practical tasks. But that may not be the case. I think the king and the statesman can still be productive while being directive, and not necessarily doing the productive tasks like orienting, or rather producing material goods, or embodying the expertise of the general or of the judge. All of these things are associations that participate in his ordering. And so the productive thing is the ordering itself. It is the weaving. The visitor continues, he says, because it knows when it is the right time to begin and set in motion the most important things in cities, and when it is the wrong time. And so this is the harmonious element. This is that musical synthesis. And while the practical expertise is not there in terms of the king or the statesman, it's not necessary for it to be. Understanding the boundaries, the identities of the things are the things that are most important in terms of understanding how to set in motion, as the visitor says, those dictates and writing into law. He says, and the others must do what has been prescribed for them. The visitor continues and he says, for this reason, then, the sorts of expertise we have just examined control neither each other nor themselves, but each is concerned with some individual practical activity of its own, and in accordance with the individual nature of the activities in question, has appropriately acquired a name that is individual to it. So like with most things, I want to pause here, perhaps rather tediously and unnecessarily so, to think about the word control. So from our Latin roots, we have contra, which is against or opposite, and rotulus, which means roll or scroll. In the Old French, we have contre-roll, which literally is a counter-roll or a duplicate register. In Middle English, we have the same that's borrowed from the French. In medieval administration, particularly in royal courts and monasteries, a contre-roll was a duplicate scroll kept to verify the accuracy of another. One clerk would maintain the main roll of accounts, and another, the controller, would keep the counter-roll to ensure no discrepancies. So the original meaning is to check by comparison, not to dominate. Over time, its sense broadened to include supervising, restraining, or directing, actions that arise from the ability to compare and judge rightly. Now, of course, throughout the ages, the idea of control as we know it today must have surely had its meaning in language. But its evolution, as it has found its way to us now, is something that perhaps should not be discounted, at least for the very point that it might afford us some interesting reflection. And I don't think that there is that much of a dissimilarity to what is being said here from its original medieval meaning and what we are discussing in terms of law and ordered reality, let's say, divine ordered reality, in the sense that when we have this role, let's say, I think about the law itself. It is sort of a copy from some original. The original is given to us fragmentally, unfortunately, such that we get some things wrong, we don't understand the context, and so our laws may not be as efficient, and our institutions may not be as sufficient or efficient. But again, that idea of a duplicate scroll kept to verify the accuracy of another is very much in line with what we have been discussing. Now the question becomes, how are we to view this control? Because it's important when we're thinking about classes that are closely related to the statesman, but also as we think about the statesman in relation to these other classes of expertise. Domination, I think, is just one aspect of what we ought to consider when we think of control. When I take control of a situation, or when I take control over my vehicle, I take control from anything that is passive to something that is more active, it is not in every case that I would use the word dominate. I could probably in some way boil it down to a domination. But there are, I think, more sophisticated words to use in various contexts. Now, if we are to be comparing our behavior to the rightness of something, and considering the rightness of something, this involves the idea of making appropriate decisions or being able to make appropriate judgments. Outside of domination, what I think has to occur is some sort of measured observation, some measured oversight, if we will. It is not as though when I'm going too fast in my car and I perhaps lose control and then regain it. In some sense, it would be strange to call this a domination. Again, it's possible to go there, but in some sense it would be strange because my regaining of control requires a certain comparative or judgmental standard that I have to, if I'm going to regain control, then I must follow a certain standard of lawful behavior on the road. So my car is not driving on the sidewalk, I'm on the road, I'm not going in and out of lanes, I'm not making inappropriate turns or running into people. All of these sorts of things set the standard for my behavior in the car. And if I'm going to gain control over something, I'm moving towards that standard. Now, again, we can reflect on the submissiveness of the car in that situation and my power over it, but it wouldn't be all that productive compared to the control over the disordered state, moving it to something that is more ordered based on a particular standard, which in this case is the law of the road or of convention as it relates to driving. So obviously in this way, when we think about the associated experts, just like we thought about when we thought about the judge as a guardian, it is not his role to control others in the sense that he directs something towards the standard, let's say, or directs an expert towards a standard. He may direct a citizen towards a standard of lawful conduct, perhaps, but not the other experts that were in question, like the general or the king legislator, for example. And the visitor says, but each is concerned with some individual practical activity of its own, and in accordance with the individual nature of the activities in question, has appropriately acquired a name that is individual to it. So there is, by their behavior, a creation of identity that's specific to their practical activity, as he says. Now, the last thing that I think is interesting is that he says they don't control others nor themselves. Now, what does this mean? Well, either it means they are directed by something else, like the Statesman, for example, or there is some process by which they are directed. It has some force, it has some direction to it, but it is not a particular person. It is more of the result of the interrelatedness among things that creates this spirit and force. For the self as it relates to expertise is an interesting thing. Surely the self is involved when we think about expertise. There are certain decisions that I have to willfully make to be an expert. I can't just choose to do nothing and to be lazy when it's time to exercise my responsibilities at work. But of course, this type of control of the self has nothing to do with the expertise in question. I don't need my expertise to control myself. This is a separate matter. But when I enter into this domain of the expert, I'm entering into a different phase or a different room of identity, let's say. And in this room of identity, what I see are a bunch of practical tools to solve certain problems. And these tools that I use to solve the problems, in order to use them accurately, according to the expertise, requires a certain sacrifice. That just as he says about the judge, or any expert, that he would not be willing to decide complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator through being overcome by presence of some sort, or fears, or feelings of compassion, or again by any enmity or friendship. Now, of course, I'm not a perfect expert, and things get in the way. But in the ideal sense, the expert's responsibility is towards their expertise and the practical tools that they possess. Young Socrates responds to the visitor, and he says, "That seems so at any rate." The visitor says, "Whereas the one that controls all of these, and the laws, and cares for every aspect of things in the city, weaving everything together in the most correct way, this embracing its capacity with the appellation belonging to the whole, we would, it seems, most appropriately call statesmanship." So we have a definition of the statesman, but we don't necessarily have these sort of practical skills, maybe. The observation of those threads that the weaver puts together, of the woof and the warp, and exactly philosophically how an expert statesman might approach particular problems. And so the visitor says, at this point we'll want, won't we, to pursue it further by reference to the model of the art of weaving, not that all the classes of things in the city have become so clear to us. He says, then it seems we should discuss the intertwining that belongs to kingship, and of what kind it is, and in what way it intertwines to render us what sort of fabric. What it seems we have to deal with in that case is certainly a difficult thing to show. To say that part of virtue is in a certain sense different in kind from virtue provides an all too easy target for those expert in disputing statements, if we view things in relation to what the majority of people think. So what does he mean here by this? So he's saying he's taking a part of virtue, not the whole of virtue. And he's saying that if this was somehow to be taken from virtue and placed outside of it as its own standalone thing, then it would be rife for dispute and that which is contrary, because it is an imperfect, or rather incomplete, identity. And if an identity is incomplete, then the ability to identify it will be only partial and incomplete. Then, of course, leaving it open to the desire to complete it, which would have that contrary nature to it. Or perhaps inquisitive, but the inquisitive nature can turn into the contrary if it is suspecting of something that is incorrect or incomplete. Now, what of this virtue? How can we define this? I think a good definition that I've read is the perfected state of any being when it acts in accordance with its telos, or its end or purpose. So again, the perfected state of any being when it acts in accordance with its end or purpose. Now we have to highlight that any being. So this could be a human being. This can be any object in front of me. It can be this nickel that's in front of me. And the question is, well, how can this nickel be virtuous? It doesn't have any inclination. It doesn't think. But I think we have to be a little careful about what we mean by it doesn't have any inclination. As far as I'm concerned, it has a lot of inclination. It is inclined towards something. It certainly participates in something, much more than the base material that it is made out of. But even the base material, it has a form of order and organization. All things do. Anything that has being, or that is being, has this sort of thing. And so, there are multiple ways in which we can think about this nickel. When we think about this definition, a perfected state of being, if we raise the question, is this nickel a perfected state of being? Now, that question can be quite broad because there are different angles that we can approach it from. Physically, it's competent. It's going to stand the test of time. It's not going to degrade readily. It's solid. Again, durable. It is of a form, of a print that we can recognize readily its value, its denomination. So as far as a currency is concerned, a coin is quite stable. It's stable physically. But then there's other aspects of this. That, okay, this 5 cents, it will remain that denomination, but its relative weight in the market or in the exchange of this being is variable. Some of it depends on the thing itself, and much of it does not. But to the degree that this nickel is able to participate in the broader concept of currency, I think is the degree to which it is virtuous, or has virtue. Now, it's a strange thing to speak of virtue in the sense of a physical object, but I think it can work. If we can understand it at this simple level, I think it makes it easier to understand human virtue. So these days, 5 cents doesn't go very far. There was a period of time in which 5 cents was more practical. It probably made sense to carry around coins if you were going shopping or doing any sort of purchasing. But today, these coins are almost all but useless. And it's a rather unfortunate fact. And so now its being is participating in something that is useful, but the purpose that it fulfills is decreasing, I suppose we can say. Its value is decreasing. Its physical form is the same. Like I said, there are factors that cause its devaluation. But because of its devaluation, regardless of its participation in that devaluation, I think reduces its virtue because it can't participate in a way that remains useful. That people pick this up and utilize its intended directionality, which is to pay for goods and services. Now let's try to extend this a little bit farther, if we can, and think about this part of virtue situation that the visitor was talking about. I think we've sort of covered it, actually. When we say part of virtue, we're saying either part of being or part of its participation in accordance with its telos. So while we may say, on one hand, it's perfected its physical form in terms of its identifiability, the other is so variable that we can have debates about whether or not coins are useful forms of currency in the modern state of things. Now we would have to have either a state in which the coin is productive, in which case we would still be sort of in the argument territory because we can imagine the constraints that would be necessary to facilitate a virtuous coin or currency, whatever. And we can also think about a currency that does not devalue and maintains some sort of physical excellence. And so there's a systemic, extended view there, which may overcomplicate this analogy that I'm trying to make simple. But after giving it a second thought, I'm not so sure that it does overcomplicate it, because I think this is exactly the point. That the coin is a part. It's not meant to be virtue in and of itself. It is perhaps a virtue that participates in the broader unity of virtues. And we have to also understand that the coin has a direction towards the center, in addition to all the other virtues, all the other types of currencies, all the other mediums of exchange. But eventually there's something at the ground of it, its value, at least in the economic sense. But if we get away from this analogy and bring this back to virtue for a moment, it might be a useful exercise to state some virtues and to go through perhaps what it would mean if one is to be separated off from the rest of them. So we take the four cardinal virtues from Plato and Aristotle. We have prudence, which is wisdom in action, the ability to discern the appropriate course. Justice, giving each their due, harmony among parts within the whole. Temperance, moderation, self-restraint, and balance of desire. Courage, steadfastness in the face of fear, endurance of the soul. We have three theological virtues from Christian Platonism. There's faith, trust in an order, no matter how unseen it is, and in divine reason. There's hope, orientation of the soul towards a good future, or a future good. There is charity, which is love as the active union of self with others and with the good. and some other classical virtues, we can say: magnanimity, greatness of soul, proper self-esteem, liberality, generosity in material goods, friendship, social virtue of reciprocal goodwill, truthfulness, honesty in speech and deed, gentleness, moderation of anger, piety, reverence for the divine or for order itself, perseverance, constancy through trial. Alright, so today is a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I was thinking about how I should tackle this. I'm not sure if I'm going to go through each and every one of these, although it's probably going to be a useful exercise to do that. I think we should start with returning to the basics. The idea of the whole of something, and perhaps what's more is the harmony of these virtues. And perhaps even from that, this idea that parts of identities or parts of things serve not only just that identity, but all identities serve something higher. And it's a matter of truth and falsehood that we come to understand things, or we come to forget things, or we get things wrong. There are so many possibilities, ways things can be combined, ways different parts can constitute some whole, and it's easy to get lost. And thankfully here we are prompted to consider virtue and the parts of virtue. But we're also asked to consider that there would be some sort of a mistake or misdeed, such that if we reflect on or take a part of virtue, it leaves it exposed to something. It's a raw injury. It is a breach in the integumentary system, as it were, such that it leaves us open to pathogen. It leaves us open to that contrary spirit for which the sophist likes to play. And it's that negativity of mind, that lack of faith in that which is good, or that which composes, that which is creative and productive, that leads us down a troublesome path. And this is something that, as we attempt to think about these virtues and to combine them, or to find a thread that goes through them and takes us higher, that we ought not to fall into this unfortunate trajectory. And throughout the day I find myself praying, perhaps not in terms of this exact circumstance, but in certainly related circumstances, of being fearful or apprehensive, or in a particular state of mind for which I understand my mind to be falling away from a positive disposition. And it's easy to get self-centered about things, and to be pushy, and to want one's desires met, when in actuality the sacrifice of immediate desire is often needed. And it takes work, I think, to harmonize the heart with reason and with good things. So let's focus on the first. Or perhaps I do want to focus on the first, but before we get to the first, I want to think about what was mentioned just a moment ago, about how these virtues can relate to one another such that they form this cohesive whole of what we would call virtue in and of itself. Not the parts of virtue, not things that are virtuous, but all of virtue. And I have to imagine here that thinking about this is quite close to thinking about the divine, thinking about God. For if we practice all of these virtues, surely it would put us in a better orientation towards that divine logos. We would be participating in goodness, surely, if we were not disjointed in our attempts to be virtuous or to understand. So the first virtue, we're talking about the cardinal virtues in the Platonic and Aristotelian sense, is prudence, or wisdom in action, the ability to discern the appropriate course. I've also heard a definition that prudence is related to appropriate care for the future. Now, in order to discern an appropriate path, one, I think, has to have an eye towards the future. There has to be this sacrificial element of the immediate. Now, what does one say here? What path do we go down? I guess this is kind of an irony. This is a bit of a microcosm for the virtue that we're talking about. Because prudence, again, is the ability to discern the appropriate course. And right now, we are in that process of discerning the appropriate course. And so maybe talking about that is the way forward. The appropriateness of course. How does one determine such a thing? Of course, there are contextual matters that are important here. So let's say we take something in particular. So I will be moving in 2 weeks. And so this means that this weekend, it happens to be a Thursday evening, I'm going to have to do a substantial amount of packing. And the moving day is next Saturday. And I've been thinking about how to approach this because it's a big task. There's a lot of things to move. There's a lot of pieces to coordinate, people to coordinate. And I think the first thing is that it requires attention. That's the first and most basic element. With regard to wisdom, however, throughout the Proverbs, wisdom emerges as something that is this idea of a participation and a fittedness among parts. Almost like the Statesman. It's a knowing how things relate to one another and how to navigate the environment of relations. And there's a few different ways, I think, that one can say how the environment ought to be navigated. We could say that it ought to be navigated well, or by the standard of the good. But also, I think, on a more practical level, not to say that that's not practical at some level, surely it is, but with regard to what I'm speaking about, with moving, what is wise, I would have to imagine, is understanding the parts that are in motion, the image, the map that is before me, and making sure that the actions, the behaviors, my attention is towards the purpose. It's towards that participation. If the thing in the end, the good in the end, in this particular case, is a successful move where all the pieces are coordinated, that all the furniture is moved and all of the services are turned down when I need them, and everything is put in order such that when the weekend is over and I return to another working week, I can sustain myself well without really establishing firmly a home, which will take time. And so the first step, that sort of minute step, is to take a small piece of something, to take a small step. It's okay, and so say, okay, if I have to start packing for this move, I have to start in a particular place. And I'm not going to just sort of sporadically start. I'm not going to just pick up things here and there and throw them in boxes. I'm going to start in a particular room. I'm going to start in a particular spot of that room. I'm going to start in a particular cabinet or a particular drawer. And I'm going to go in this fashion across the drawers, through the closet, and move on to the next space until that is cleared away. And I think it's this sort of one step at a time, labeling boxes, make sure that they are organized, and putting them in places that will make it so that it will be easily moved when the time comes to move them. All of these actions, I think, are prudent actions because they participate in the good of, or the purpose of, what is being done, and that is to move successfully and smoothly. So the next term to discuss is justice. Giving each their due, harmony among parts within the whole. So we can already see emerging how there's a relationship between justice and prudence. Wisdom has to do with the visual field and the participation of the nodes in that network, or the participation of the whole, or the parts of the whole. It is that shifting and sifting through all of those various relations. Justice is giving, perhaps, what it would seem as a proper observation to the identities. Now, I say that in light of what the definition is here, giving each their due. Now, I think giving each their due can refer to either the identities of all things, but also the other virtues that we are discussing here, or of foundational particulars. But I suppose it doesn't really matter at some level. Eventually we would have to discuss these things, like justice as it relates to the harmony of the soul, reason, and appetites, of justice as it relates to prudence, temperance and courage, justice as it relates to the various elements that go into play considering my move to a new home. And so while prudence is this care of action, of which path to take, justice seems to be a harmonization among parts. And surely there is an overlap between them, these virtues, that is. We can take this a step farther and consider what we've just experienced in this dialogue with the judge. The judge is somebody that is restricted to a particular standard. That standard is law. And it is not for him to go outside of the law. It is within his expertise to make judgments based on that standard. And justice, in this context, is presumably the degree to which the judge can appropriately decide on matters of guilt as it relates to the intended precedent or spirit of law, let's say. And so, as a matter of coherence, I consider a judge sort of removed from that civic responsibility, and a judge placed in the domain of the agent, for which there are many things that can be judged upon. we still retain the standard. The standard is truth. And by this sort of expertise of being a judge and executing justice in this respect must necessarily involve prudence, to see the map, to see the nodes of the network. But it is also by this standard to move into harmony the tasks, or I think simplistically here, I think the up down, the 1 and the 0, the yes and the no, it is making these simple decisions that sort of build over time, that give a matter of complexity to it. That when I put a box together, it doesn't disassemble under the weight of the books that I'm going to be putting in there. It is a just box if it can participate in its purpose. In a like manner, when I utilize a friend and I use a dolly to move big furniture, it is just when the apparatus has been safely and what would we say? Not necessarily swiftly. Safe is a good word. Safely moved on the dolly out of my place into the truck and into a place where the object is unharmed, because the safety and the nature of the object must necessarily remain the same to be transferred to this new place. Otherwise, the degradation of the identity of the thing would loosen the bonds of the homely experience, and it would cause a disruption in the grand purpose, which again is the moving of all materials from one place to another. So today is a new day, and I'm hoping to round out this episode today because it's gone quite long. I want to go over the last two of the 4 cardinal virtues that are common to Plato and Aristotle. The last two are temperance and courage, the two probably that I struggle with the most. So starting with temperance, we have moderation, self-restraint, and balance of desire. One of my principal concerns, as it relates to my relationship with God, has been this exact thing. There are multiple things, maybe not many, but there are multiple things that contribute, in my case, to this lack of moderation or lack of self-restraint. And the desire, of course, is to have that pull towards goodness, such that the restraint is not necessarily made easier, perhaps, but the pursuit of being held so tightly reduces the likelihood of devolving into some type of inattentiveness. And like I said, there are many things that this can manifest in, but ultimately I think it boils down to the perversion of attention and that lack of constancy that is required for things required to achieve good things. And in that pursuit of achieving good things, there is a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is painful. And when I find myself in the mode of lacking this self-restraint, I find myself in my mind wishing to be more passive. It's a type of weakness. It is something that does not accept the call, so to speak, when certain problems arise, and the solution to them I know must be completeness, and yet I desire only partial completion at times, because this will be enough to relieve some of the burden, but not completely. And it's a bizarre quality, a poor quality, surely. And I suppose I should say that doesn't happen all of the time, but it happens more than I would like it to. And of course, this is a matter that I pray on. Moderation, balance, these sorts of things are not easy. When I think about physical balance, for example, as sort of an analogy when we approach the heart's desire, if somebody is balancing on one leg, or they're balancing on a compliant surface, an unstable surface, to do so is not easy. It requires effort to do it, and that effort requires attention. So there is this sort of strain on the mind when one is engaged in this activity. Now, I think this is compounded when we look at the topic at hand, when we look at temperance, and we think about the heart and all of the various directions that the heart can exude its wonderful expression. And unfortunately, I think that there are things that provide it with a gratification that can be instant, but it can be overpowering. Even if it's not instant, it can be overpowering. Even if it requires a degree of sacrifice, we could still find ourselves in a difficulty long term, because we haven't balanced the desire for good things, but rather we've accepted a certain trade, that we desire something that we may achieve in the long term, but we have made poor sacrifices along the way. And for my part, I think I probably participate in a little bit of both, unfortunately. So I'd like to explore a thought that's sort of bubbling up in my mind. There's two different images. One comes from our work on the Proverbs. The heart is brought up so many times in the book of Proverbs, in the Old Testament. And one is prompted to consider, to go through that process of reflecting and thinking about the ways in which our hearts, my heart, is oriented. And I've used various analogies to approach it. One of them that I've come back to from time to time has been the heart as sort of like a factory, an industrial machine with certain qualities to it. Now, there's an inconsistency. I wouldn't want to say that the heart is an industrial product, surely, but it operates in a certain fashion that is similar to that of industry. That it has certain products. The heart by itself, as we've learned in the book of Proverbs, is not so basic as something that produces raw materials or base materials that can be used farther on down some manufacturer process for further refinement. It has that quality, surely, because we have our base emotions, we have our base desires, we have things that immediately well up in us that our reason is unable to catch before it happens. Part of this temperance is learning how to experience the emotions without having them take over our behavior and subject our reason to it. But nonetheless, thinking about this analogy of the factory, we have this structure that is producing all of these emotions and feelings. They are often tied to reason. Sometimes reason takes the back seat. Sometimes our reason is the cause for our desire and our emotion. And so this interesting relationship with that side of things is also present. The other image is an image of the self, which sometimes I like to think about as a cell or a city, in which there is some boundary, like any identity, anything that can be identified. There is a boundary that maintains a separation, but also it establishes the coherence of that identity. This is, in the Sophist, we started to use the queen as a symbol, the chess piece of the queen as a symbol for this non-being, this descriptor that surrounds being and identifies things. This analogy of the cell, on one hand, I'm no expert in terms of the cell, but I have a basic understanding of what this structure is. And I think it's a good analogy as we relate it to the self. Not only is it a good relationship to the self, but it is also a good relationship in understanding the way in which an identity can be influenced, changed, or maintained. When we think about parts, when we think about the unification of these parts, or the destruction of the being, and the confusion that results from the parts as they separate out into this diluted, chaotic mess. Now, one of the things that I think is most interesting about this cell analogy is that it has the cell walls that surround it. The cell walls are selective in terms of what is brought into the cell and what leaves it. And part of its function is also protection. And by this protection, the maintenance or the identity of the cell is maintained. If the cell wall were to just vanish and diminish, and the intracellular contents were left to the extracellular environment, we would have, just as I've mentioned, some sort of dissolution into a chaotic environment. And of course, this would be the destruction of the identity. When we think about temperance, when we think about this self-restraint and moderation, controlling our desires, I think about this structure. I think about the structure in terms of the heart, but also the self, the broader self, about the things that are kept away from the deepest cohering parts of that identity, and the things that are let in. And some things are let in that should not be let in. Some things are kept in that ought not to be kept in. There's many different relationships and possibilities that can result in experience. So, the question then is, where exactly should we go from here? The original purpose was to talk about these 4 cardinal virtues and to close off this episode 14, part 14 that is, of the Statesman. So what I like to do with temperance, before we move on to the next, which is courage, is to maybe reflect on a particular experience. Now, I've mentioned there are things that I struggle with in particular, and these particulars have been a matter of prayer to resolve. Now, this particular experience, the first thing I think about is the disciplines in my life. One of them is this podcast that I'm engaged in. The other is exercise, and I think the other I can say is work. In the interim, in the periods for which I am not engaged in these things, sometimes when I'm engaged in them, unfortunately, the mind is unable to hold attention. There are days, it's not very frequent, it's infrequent, but there are days in which my mind is just unable to focus, such that I'm sitting in front of my microphone for an hour, and the thoughts just will not come. They're anywhere else other than where they should be. And to expand this out, there are periods in the interim where the disciplines, or when I'm not working, for which this potential temptation rises, for which the mind desires a certain sense of passivity or to engage in things that are, that gives a sense of euphoria, a cheap euphoria that doesn't provide any real meaning. And this type of behavior is a sin, surely. It reflects a certain type of lethargy, a laziness. And the difficulty is keeping the mind attentive, but also not letting it fall to that rigidity that would cause it to be so ischemic that it's unable to feel refreshed and replenished by the disciplines that it participates in. So to get into the particular example, I have a friend that I value very much. We differ in certain respects, personality respects, but it's not a negative difference. It's a difference that I think lends to our friendship. And it's there's a certain type of admiration that I have for his character, in the sense that his mind is always moving to the next thing. It is always busy with something. He is somebody that is not particularly into the intellectual side of things. He very much has a physical, grounded disposition. Now he does have for his work, he works with technology, so there is this sort of abstractness that he has to his mind, and I surely would not call him unreasonable. He is, like I said, he is somebody that is constantly busy and doing things, and by this constant busyness and goal setting, he achieves quite a lot. And it's not as though this person is going to be scoring very high on exams. If I suppose he was forced to, he would have no problem to do it, but his mind is such that he needs a purpose. And that purpose that's in front of him is the thing that guides his reason. And this is something that is admirable. I think this is something that is a virtue. It is something that we think about when we are considering the Statesman. Everything is layered in these purposes. We think about the monarch, which is the centerpiece of the identity, holding all of the parts together. There is a very strong responsibility on the part of this individual to maintain that structure. And part of that is understanding where to go. It's what purpose are we aiming at? How are we to do this? How are we to integrate the parts? My friend is very good at this. And the places that I lack is the seeming constancy that he possesses. So the last thing I want to talk about before we end this episode and begin a new one is courage. Steadfastness in the face of fear, and endurance of the soul. A beautiful quality. Now what comes to mind here is my weakness as it relates to public speaking and perhaps novel situations. It certainly is not as bad as it used to be when I was younger, but novel situations in the sense that I'm interacting with people that have a particular level of expertise. There have been many times where I've felt my heart become so active in the face of these difficulties that it entirely invades my reason. And I've had the presence of mind to reflect on it as it happens. And it's a curious matter that I find it much like this states the infrequent times for which I sit down in front of this microphone and I can't get myself to record anything. The state of mind is similar to that. There's some physiological response. The heart rate elevates a little bit, and maybe there's some sweating. There's certainly an elevation and temperature. And all of these factors seem to enter into the mind and to imprison reason or subject it to it. And it's so subject to it that behaviors that can result can be irrational. In my more difficult moments, especially in a bad public speech, for example, if I have this sort of nervousness, I guess, there may be this quivering of the speech, and certainly, most importantly, the inability to pay attention. And aside from the personal embarrassment that came from these events, I sort of wonder if it would happen now. It probably would not be as bad since I'm older and I have some life experience. But surely, in my school days, I had much difficulty with it. And there are elements of it that I could still appreciate now, where I may be going into a situation for which many of the surrounding parts of the problem are foreign to me, and it becomes overwhelming. And there's a certain steadfastness that's required to solve the problem. And I think it's directly related to courage. And this is another matter that I think, as I've mentioned before, I feel that I am weakest. It is something that has improved as I've gotten older, surely. But the control and the calming of the mind in these situations that excite it to such a degree that seemingly nothing else matters except for the excitement itself is something in all cases I wish to have control over. So, the end of this is more of a personal reflection than it is a relation to this dialogue, so my apologies, but I think this will conclude this part 14 of the Statesman. We will continue next time.